over to you, Tom.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so as Ollie mentioned, I'm going to be giving a brief kind of talk about my company Verticode and what our approach is to minimum viable products. I think specifically talking about the process of getting ready for a minimum viable product, and I guess when you get to execution point, what you should be looking for. And I'll kind of drop in examples of what we've done with clients we've worked on throughout. And of course, I think what I'll do is leave some time at the end for questions. I know the topic of minimum viable product is kind of super subjective for a lot of people. What defines what a minimum viable product is kind of for some people can almost be a bit of a sore point. So I'd be interested to hear thoughts from everyone else as well. But for the time being, let me share my screen and then you can get it going. Just as I kind of mentioned there, it'd be good to, I'll kind of not got a huge amount of slides to go through, but it'd be good to save questions for the end. And I think we can, there's always a chance to kind of almost strikes up a discussion as well. So hopefully you can all see what I'm presenting. Although I've actually not done that quite in the way I wanted. So give me a sec. That's better. Hopefully you can all see that. Great. So yeah, just a bit about me to start with. So yeah, we really focus on minimum viable products. My company Verticode. Specifically, what we do, our real mission is to lower the barriers for minimum viable product launch for aspiring tech founders. We use technology that we've built in house to accelerate the development of effectively, very simple applications, whether that be web applications focusing on kind of mobile use or desktop use, whether that be kind of browser extensions or things like even API development as well. So what we're really focusing on is bringing together a founder-friendly offering to MVP development. And I think the thing that I want to kind of highlight here is that when I talk about minimum viable products, as I mentioned, people have different definitions of what that is. What I'm referring to is really the first version of your actual product. So for a lot of our founders, they would have run an MVP of sorts, which would have been completely manual. It would have been them doing something which just involves them kind of running back and forth from the shops to get stuff going and things like that. But actually, what we're talking about here is the first iteration of your product. And I think the reason that we've focused so much on that version of the product, which is to some extent scalable, is that the funding landscape over the last couple of years has meant that for founders who previously might have been able to go and raise funding based on some Figma prototypes or the use of some response they've had to some experiments they've run, that now is much more of a struggle than it used to be. And actually, a lot of investors are looking for real traction, but also the development of real technology to back up people's pitch decks and back up people's valuations. And so that's why people are often turning to a real minimum viable product, a product of itself with real traction before going out for that funding. And that's where we kind of operate and trying to allow people to get that product launched without needing a huge round behind them. In terms of how we do it, we really focus on rapid builds. So speaking specifically about tech here, rapid builds, affordable pricing, the option for fast iteration for our founders when they, for instance, starting to get really strong feedback from their users. They need to change, they need to pivot a bit quickly. We're always on hand to do that. Fully coded products, as I mentioned earlier, having the actual tech stack starting to build up is huge for a lot of investors. And of course, something which is sort of more of an anti-development agency point, but no estimates. We don't kind of inflate our costs or inflate our timelines when we're kind of mid-build. A bit about us, just kind of very briefly, is founded Q3 2022, so we're not a hugely old company. In that time, we've launched over 40 MVPs, so we've seen lots of tech founders go down lots of different routes, and we meet founders. Some of them have had their ideas for 9 years. Some of them have had their idea 2 weeks ago and done some really rapid user surveys to get some feedback and then want to launch. So we've seen it all. And in terms of the way we build, our 2-week standard build time is what really helps get founders over that line. And the markets we operate are predominantly UK and US, effectively kind of roughly 50-50, although we do occasionally work with founders from Europe and also from Australia as well. That's just a bit about us and the kind of the background of where this all comes from and my experience individually. In terms of the topic of minimum viable products, I know I kind of defined a little bit there about what I see or what I'm referring to when we talk about MVPs here, but just to kind of drill a bit more deeply in that, we're talking about the version of the product with just enough features to be usable by early customers who can then provide feedback for future product development. So really that last sentence, I think, is the key here. You're looking to launch something, get some early adopters on board, and then use them to guide you effectively moving forward. Of course, where people who use experiments, maybe before they built their MVP, might do some experiments. The difference with running an experiment is, although it can give you a really good idea about the market for your product and whether there's going to be good uptake for it, it doesn't necessarily help you so much with developing future features. That's something which is much easier to do and can only really be done once you've actually got a base product for your users to be connecting with, and the basis for you to be collecting feedback from them. So that's what I just wanted to highlight quickly. And within that, of course, it's important to highlight, why is an MVP important? I think everyone in here has got entrepreneurial experience or entrepreneurial exposure. So we'll all know the stories of the people who go straight to their version 1, build out all the bells and whistles, only to find out there's no market for it and they need to pivot, but they've run out of money. So I'm sure, these points are things which people here will be able to resonate with. But the real point of an MVP is around, firstly, proving your concept. I've put in brackets there to investors. I think that's one thing that has become more and more prominent recently, using a minimum viable product to reach investors because of that real kind of reliance they put on traction and things like that. But I think similarly, proving your concept to yourself is a big part. I think, I speak to a lot of really young founders, and actually proving the concept to their parents, if they're going to have to go to, if they're kind of lining up whether to go to a very graduate job or whether to pursue this tech idea they've got, they need to be proving their concept, that there's something viable there without putting too much skin in the game. Similarly, connecting with your customers early, like I mentioned, having that basis to actually interact with your early adopters, which can be really difficult if you're just going around with Figma prototypes. Guiding and de-risking future features. Of course, de-risking meaning if you're kind of considering putting in a review system for your kind of dog walking marketplace, and you want to validate whether that's actually the way that people want to be rating dog walkers, and that's specifically talking about, asking your clients or your users, is this something you would use? Is this something you want? If you're getting resounding drivers from them, then absolutely, that's how you drive forward. And the last point, of course, slightly morbid, but damage limitation. If it is a terrible idea, if there is no market for any reason, then damage limitation is a huge part of it, and making sure that you haven't put too much out there before you're realizing that this isn't something you're going to pursue going forward. So within that, there are a few kind of aspects within preparing your MVP, which I think are really important. I think the first two here are kind of conceptual around any kind of project you should be undertaking, and the last two are more specifically around the tech side of things, and if you're launching a tech product. So I'll take you through them. I think the first one is key across kind of any project, any venture, which I'm sure many of these people on the call have kind of gone through this process as well. But starting with solid questions to answer, being really mission critical. And I think I'll explain a little bit more about that here. So this is I've kind of used a bit of an example about from one of the founders that that we came across and we worked with a bit, but questions to be answered, and about asking the right questions and being bold with the questions that you want your MVP to validate, or in reality to invalidate for you. So answering those mission critical questions, which if they're not proven, then you really need to go and rethink. Specifically, asking questions which are binary, yes or no. You can be very sure whether you've achieved them or not, but also very customer centric. You want to be focusing on the users themselves. So the example which I've kind of alluded to at the bottom there is effectively, I'm oversimplifying this product a bit for the nature of the time we've got, but effectively a platform which is kind of like Uber for domestic cleaners. There are similar things out there. There's a few twists on this one, but I think in terms of what they're looking to validate for their project and for their long-term viability of their company, is about asking the right questions about who would want to have kind of a random cleaner turn up at their house and be able to kind of clean without kind of having any worries about that. Similarly, in the way you're happy to be picked up by a random driver from Uber. Now, on the left there, I put what example of a bad question would be here. You can't validate this business idea just by asking, do people need cleaners? Things like that. The demand for cleaners is something which has been validated through the existence of an industry. Just because people need cleaners doesn't mean that people will need your service or need your offering. You need to be more specific and more kind of mission critical about what you're doing here. The example on the right there is, being more specific, would families let strangers clean their house? I think that's kind of an interesting question. Families tend to be the exact same demographic of those people who are using cleaners and cleaning services. And so would a family let strangers clean their house? That's something you need to go out there and validate. If the answer to that is no, then you've lost a huge part of your market, and you kind of should be looking to pivot from your MVP effectively. The next part is making that statement about exactly what needs to be learned from whom. Having a statement which you effectively, you should be kind of referring back to as you go through the MVP process. So not just why you're doing it, but who you're learning from. As you'll see, these statements are the same, but there's kind of a different emphasis within them. So why are you making the particular MVP? So this is another platform example which we came across, which was to help students return books to the library when it was going to be overdue. So the way they were going to start off was having people kind of very simply just register that they've got books which are going to be overdue at certain times, and then people going around to their halls and collecting them, delivering them back to the library. Obviously, an MVP stage starting with really localized, and the idea being they could kind of roll it out more widely. There's a number of kind of considerations with an MVP that focus on students, which I'm sure many people here are aware of. But what they were looking to learn was, we need to learn whether students will pay for overdue library books to be returned by a third party. I think there's a few things within that, but I think for instance, whether students would trust a third party to deliver the books back in time is one thing, but also a big part there, which people know, is whether students will pay for library books to be returned. I think a lot of people will understand that getting students to pay for anything can be a bit of a struggle. So that's really focusing on not just what you're looking to learn, but who you're looking to learn it from. And I think having a statement like that from the outset just enables you to keep realigning yourself as you're going through the experimental phase and learning from your MVP effectively. So this is more kind of looking at actually the product side of things, and how you get to that process of really scoping your minimum viable product. And I think that's all within the minimum feature set. I think these are just sort of tips and things which we see often, which founders sometimes want, but kind of are very tempting, but you should be kind of steered clear. I think the first one here is, it's very important to make sure the customer journeys are as simple as possible. So I think there's a few things within this, but in reality, the main thing is that you want your users to be doing something which, when you're getting feedback from them, you're not getting the feedback that, oh, I got a bit lost when I was jumping from this page to this page to that page. More that you want your feedback from your users to be things like, well, I didn't find this useful because on the weekends I don't use platforms like this. So you want to be keeping things concept driven. Whereas if you're making convoluted user journeys, the feedback you're going to get is going to be product based rather than concept based, and that's where you're going to start to have issues and really struggle to collect that really good feedback. I think kind of leading on from that, the next point about ensure the users understand the core purpose of the MVP. This comes into your feature set because it's basically saying to you, don't put things in there which are going to be taking people away from the core purpose and their understanding. The very nature of kind of innovative products is that people will be using them for the first time, most likely. So not something they've done before. So you want to understand that, make sure that they know that that's what they're there to do. This is what's going to solve the problem for them. Understanding who users will be, I kind of alluded to it a second ago, but having a minimum viable customer base is really important. People you can access easily, but also people you can cater the MVP towards a little bit to make sure that it's going to be applicable to them, and then they can move forward with it. When you kind of roll it out to wider industries or things like that, you can always take that into account as well. And the last point is really just don't distract your users. This is maybe a little bit less about minimum feature set, but we meet a lot of founders, for instance, who want to do all kinds of crazy design things and make things really unique. And I think the point which it leads into these first 2 points as well is that your users are there to do one thing, and that's to go through a user journey, kind of go through one function. Hopefully that platform will deliver some value to them, and then really the role is for you to go and collect feedback on how that process was. Did it work for them? Did it solve the problem that you were envisioning it would? And things like, will they return to the platform? What you're not looking to do is wow people with kind of designs which they've never seen before, and might make people even feel uncomfortable. And if it's things like having a sort of slice of pizza instead of having a cursor, these are things which not only are going to kind of waste your resource when you're in the MVP phase, but just aren't going to add any value. So beyond that, I think this is something just kind of as a snapshot of the way that we kind of go around feature sets. It's basically impact versus resource. Some of you may have seen this before, and effectively for MVP phase, you're looking at this top right quadrant. Things which are going to be really impactful for your customer base and are going to be low resource for you to include. So whether you're building something yourself, where your resource is going to be your time, you want to be focusing on high impact and little time to make, little time to build, and that's how you can get on that wheel of collecting feedback quicker. Similarly, if you're paying a development agency to build for you, similarly, you want something which is low resource so that they can not, you don't have to pay extra for them to do it, but it also is high impact. When you're looking at things which are low resource, low impact, occasionally you might stray into this if you're thinking of something which is going to be able to kind of help it tailor it for a certain kind of early adopter group. Similarly, occasionally, you will have one feature from the high resource, high impact. That's okay as long as it's balanced out overall. Of course, some features are just impossible to create with low resource. And anything in this lower left quadrant in the high resource, low impact aspect, you're really looking at that for way down the road where you're starting to add peripheral functionality specifically. I think the one thing here, which is important from a product perspective, is of course is being ready to measure that customer enthusiasm, because that's what's driving your next features, your next functionality, and really your product going forward. I think there's kind of 3 pillars here which I've mentioned, but obviously there's a lot more, and I think everyone here will probably have experience of collecting feedback. But from an MVP product perspective, I've alluded to it earlier, being concept driven. So does this solve a problem for you? Are you having your needs met, as opposed to things like, how are you enjoying the color palette, and what are the features that you enjoy? Those aren't going to get you to that next stage of your development. I think that's really key about being concept driven. Judging actions. This is at the very core of what's in the difference between having a Figma prototype that you put in front of people and actually having a live minimum viable product, is that you can judge actions. Often in a survey, or there'll be people who will say they'll buy something, or they'll say they'll behave in a certain way. The only way you can be sure is by judging those actions. And so that's a key part of collecting feedback, is using tools, whether that be kind of Google Analytics or Microsoft Clarity or Hotjar, to effectively judge exactly what your users are actually doing on your platform, on your product, rather than what they've said they might do in a hypothetical scenario. And I think, just as a general point on the right there, operating in the extremes, I think when we're interviewing people, we have a tendency to leave the door open for lukewarm responses, which, as you can see at the bottom, I've kind of encouraged everyone to avoid. We've definitely seen examples in the past where our founders have gone out there, spoken to their users, effectively had responses which sound like things are okay. Yes, I like it. Yes, it's good. Not rather than passionate sort of responses of, this is amazing, I know exactly what needs to be next. And that's when they get into danger of building functionality which they've kind of put into people's laps and actually isn't driving that much value for them. So operating the extremes in terms of getting, what do you hate the most about this? What do you love the most about this? And then going from there for your future iterations. So the last point I wanted to highlight from there is, once you're collecting that feedback, of course, what you're doing is, I'm sure anyone who's kind of read the Lean Startup or anything will be on to this, the build, measure, learn cycle. And of course, that's when you're starting to continue to collect data about your customers, basically put those into ideas, building those ideas in, and then going through the whole process again of measuring how they're acting with them, starting to collect that data, build, measure, learn. And I think any good entrepreneur will tell you that cycle is obviously very applicable to MVP stage, but is also applicable beyond MVP and sort of for the rest of your product life cycle. And then that never ends. I think all good entrepreneurs will be constantly rotating around this triangle. Okay, great. Well, that is everything that I had in my deck. So I've definitely wanted to leave some time for questions. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen so you can see me on the full screen, and then open up for any questions that anyone had.
Tom, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Very, very clear, crisp, and useful. Have we got any questions from anyone on Tom's talk this afternoon? Let's have a look. I've got one question, Tom.
Yeah, go ahead.
Keeping it simple is very difficult for a lot of founders. They like to really over think about stuff and complicate stuff and reach out and make it sort of over design it, if you like. We've got a really good designer on today's call in Neil. What would you advise if you work with many founders? A lot of them show this sort of tendency. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think, you're absolutely right that a lot of founders, especially kind of inexperienced founders, have this idea that that the kind of uniqueness of what they're building is going to be their differentiator. And I think it's really about bringing back to the core values of what the problem they're trying to solve is. I think from our point of view, and actually I'll be really interested to hear what kind of Neil thinks of this as an experienced designer, but we really focus on driving home that point of not distracting your founders at the early stage, especially for the MVP stage. That seems to resonate, seems to work for a lot of founders that, you're trying to solve a particular problem and also trying to drive home that kind of that narrative that what they're trying to do here is not onboard millions of customers. What they're trying to do here is validate a concept, which, for a lot of founders is you're validating a concept to create traction. In reality, for your MVP to go and raise some money. You're not looking to onboard your first 2 million customers and start to build massive revenues with your MVP. So really about keeping it simple so that those founders, well, those users rather, don't get thrown off course and don't start kind of bouncing and leaving the platform effectively.
Thanks, Tom.
I just sorry, Neil, let you go first. You were directed at you.
No, well, no, I was you ladies first, please.
Well, no, I was just going to say that this is obviously a little bit of something that, I mean, Tom and I, we kind of work together anyway, because it is at this point of kind of it's the sentimental relationship, which often is, sometimes we call it a minimum lovable product rather than minimum viable product, because it is trying to create a connection, but it's trying to get to a person that they need to earn hundreds and then get to the thousands and then get to the millions. But it's like it's that stepping stone approach, which I think Tom's really clearly taken us through today. And it is, you can't run before you can walk. So how can you learn, but learn in a way that is actually really purposeful?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's that point of that. This isn't to say that when you get to that kind of minimum lovable, minimum marketable stage, that's not to kind of put those down, as obviously those are completely valid stages of your product journey. But it's just that don't over construct to the point of leaving yourself at risk of having to then deconstruct, which is obviously costly, time consuming, can really halt your momentum. Yeah, sorry, Neil, go ahead.
Well, no, just really fascinating. Yeah, I'm very much in the space of minimum lovable products. But I'm kind of interested to know how you go through the decision-making process with your founders, because the challenge I often face and see is they're always thinking inside out. And they can solve everybody's problem and they can save the world, just like I can as a designer. I will be saving the world in the not too distant future. But it's kind of, you've got to kind of go, well, actually, you need to get out of the way between, the services you offer and what your audience need from you, or what your customers need for you. So how do you take them through that decision-making process, and how do you stop them or get them wheat from the chaff, I think is the term I'm looking for. How do they get to the real, well, this proves it will work and this will be a business model that takes us forward. So how do you get to that point?
Yeah, I think what we try and do is really hone in on the problem that they're solving effectively. So we try to, especially in our early conversations with them, we don't try and talk too much about what product are you trying to build. I think that's really, you leave yourself very open to, like you mentioned, sort of this spiraling which founders can go through, which is like, we'll do this and then it'll lead to this and then it'll lead to this. You think, okay, well, let's actually, these steps 2s, 3s, and 4s should be driven by your customer feedback, not by something which you ideated kind of when you woke up this morning. So we really try and focus on the problem that's being solved, and then we try to, rather than kind of having that kind of one-way interaction of how is this going to work for your customers. Obviously, there is a little bit of that always, because we're working often with domain experts, so they'll have an idea about how people are operating. But I think really about, okay, this is the problem you're going to solve, and then effectively talking with our developers saying, how does someone solve that problem in the most cost-effective way, but also that sets a basis for scalability. So I think basically honing in on the problem is really how we've managed to do that. Because I think in the early days, especially when we tried to sort of take instruction on what product we were building, yeah, like I'm sure you had experience of, that's where stuff really gets out of hand.
One very quick follow-up. Do you do customer testing?
We don't do customer testing. Our founders do that themselves.
Right, fair enough. Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Neil, Andrew has a question, and then Jamie.
Yep, thanks, Ollie. Hi, Tom. I think the business, obviously, is an early stage founder. I think the business is about 18 months in now. I'm just keen to hear from you about what some of the best bits have been for you as an early stage founder, and perhaps one or two challenges and lessons learned along the way so far.
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, there's been lots of I think one of definitely our challenges is learning how we kind of interact with customers. I think, we've obviously gone really hard with all our marketing, everything about, focusing on the minimum viable product and getting people live and getting people up and running. I think it's probably only in the last, because of the nature of what we do, obviously, it's only in the last sort of 6 months we actually had to start to deal with founders who are going beyond that stage, because we're a young company. But so really that's been one of our huge obstacles and learnings over the last 6 months or so, has been how we actually continue to manage our customers once they're kind of starting to move beyond MVP stage. How do we continue to add value to them rather than them just having a product which they continue to launch or have launched and then are starting to collect feedback on. And that's been kind of rewarding, but also extremely challenging. Having set ourselves up with with an image, and then having to kind of diversify that image moving forward to try and meet their ongoing demands. In terms of what I kind of love the most, I think definitely we've kind of built a little team now, and I think that's my thing I've loved the most. I think for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that amazing feeling when you hire someone or someone joins your team who you realize can do the things that you were doing 100 times better than you were doing them, and has a lot more time to dedicate to them, which is, I think, one of the greatest feelings in the world, surely. And so that's been really, and just the level of productivity we've been able to achieve just by having more people, which I guess doesn't say much about my productivity, but I think that's been the key part for sure. Jamie.
Thanks, Andrew. Jamie.
Really quick question. You mentioned inexperienced founders. I would plonk myself firmly in that camp. And I'm hoping you can educate me here a little bit. In terms of minimum viable product, how do you create that whilst also balancing a really strong proposition for the problem you're trying to solve, right? Because you had the graph there of kind of major features and resource, right? So it's, how do you balance that out and keep the proposition super strong?
Well, I think from the MVP stage, there's a couple of things there. So not wanting to overstretch yourself in terms of your targeting with that MVP. I think you're always setting yourself up for a bit of a, not necessarily a failure, but you're going to stretch yourselves if you're aiming to kind of scale your MVP to 100,000 people or whatever straight off the bat. I think start with kind of people who are accessible to you. I mentioned that sort of like high resource versus like high impact axis. That also can be used for finding early adopters. You know, who's easy for you to find, who will adopt it and still be a valuable user. So not necessarily just like your mate who's not that applicable to it, but people you can access who actually will be good early adopters and give you good usable feedback. And then I think the other side of it is, I think your question around kind of how do you balance it. That has to be a kind of decision you make based on feedback you're getting. But the point I would make is that if you start as small as you possibly can, even if you then find out from your users that you need to expand a little bit from there, that's better than over expanding to begin with and then finding out that you need to scale back.